All right, today we are talking all about stream flow. So I'm talking about rivers. And when we talk about rivers, we have to kind of first just identify something that you probably already know, and that rivers travel downhill pulled by gravity. I know it's pretty simple, but I just have to say it. There are several different terms that we can use to help us kind of talk about rivers and compare rivers. The first one is velocity, and velocity is just simply the speed the water is flowing in the channel. It's important to know that the fastest moving part of a river can actually change depending on if it's flowing straight or if it's flowing, let's say, in a bend or a turn. When a river is just flowing straight downstream, the fastest moving water is on the surface in the middle of the stream. And this is because there's the least amount of friction. There's the least amount of things slowing it down. When a river goes into a turn, on the other hand, a body in motion wants to stay in motion. So the fastest moving part of the river ends up migrating towards the outside of the bank. It goes to the outside of the turn. Another term is gradient, and gradient is just the slope of a river. And if you think about math for a second, when you hear that word slope, hopefully you think of rise over run. And that's what we can think of as the gradient or the slope of a river. It is the rise or the elevation change that takes place over a run or a distance on Earth's surface. And gradient directly impacts the velocity of a river. The steeper the gradient, the faster the water is going to travel. Another term that we have to know is discharge. And the discharge of a river is really just the volume, the quantity of water that flows past a certain point in a given unit of time. So the way I usually imagine this is if you're standing on one side of a river, you're on the bank, and you have a net in your hand. And you can throw that net across the river to the other side, and it's touching the bottom of the river so that every drop of water flowing through the river flows through the net. And what discharge is, it just means that if you stand on the side of that net with a stopwatch and you time 1 minute, the discharge would be the quantity of water that flows through that net in 1 minute. So it is a volume, it's a length and a width and a depth of water. And a couple factors that can change discharge are velocity and also the size of the river channel itself. If I were to ask 10 different people to picture a river in their head, it's very possible that every single person could be picturing and visualizing a different river. And that's just because rivers change from where they start to where they enter into the ocean or where they end. From the head to the mouth, the top to the bottom, there's this progression, this evolution of the stream that takes place. A young river up in the mountains, at the beginning, we call upstream rivers, and they have certain characteristics. Some of those characteristics are like a steep gradient that produces a high velocity. Because these rivers are normally not as deep and they're not as wide, they usually have a very low discharge. The fast-moving water tends to erode straight downward, making a V-shaped channel for these rivers. And also the bottom of the river is really rocky. All of the smaller sand and sediment gets washed away, just leaving this rocky sediment, big chunks of rock and gravel on the bottom. If we compare this to a downstream river, one that is closer to, let's say, the ocean or the mouth of a river, the characteristics are just exactly flipped. In this case, you'd have a very high discharge because these rivers have a lot of tributaries, or it's a bunch of small rivers feeding into one major river like the Mississippi. It also has a high discharge because they are wide and they are deep, but it has a very slow velocity and a very low gradient. These rivers that are normally closer to sea level tend to erode side to side, making U-shaped channels and making rivers that kind of bend all over the place, which we call that meandering, when it bends left and right, back and forth. If you were to walk on the bottom of one of these rivers, it would be very much silt and sand and kind of that muck that gets stuck between your toes. Ew. When we talk about a river and flowing from the top to the bottom, really all water wants to get to base level. Okay, base level is just an elevation that a river cannot erode deeper than. And there's a couple different types of base level. The first type of base level is temporary base level. An example might be Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is not sea level, but rivers that flow into Lake Michigan, like the Grand River up there by Pronto Pups and Grand Haven, okay, that river, the Grand River, can never erode deeper than the level of Lake Michigan. Otherwise, Lake Michigan would flow into the Grand River. So when a river gets close to its temporary base level, instead of eroding downward and deeper, it erodes side to side, and that's where we get the meandering, the bends. Another type of base level is ultimate base level, and this is indeed sea level, the ocean. No river can really erode deeper than the ocean, sea level, because again, the ocean then would flow onto land, into the continents, and that doesn't happen. When a river gets close to its ultimate base level, it just erodes side to side, meandering. That's it for today, so make sure you ask questions and make sure you take some good notes. Thanks.